Muy buenas tardes entonces, ya estamos para comenzar.
Good afternoon, so we are ready to start. Please take your seats. I'd like to, before we start, I'd like to tell you that those who are in the tables and want to speak, once the possibility is open by the moderator, you can use the microphone by pressing the microphone. I think some are on. Yes, those two are on. So having said this, we welcome you again, distinguished participants of this first session
Discusión de alto
of the panel of high-level discussion on the creation of good frameworks for financing energetic transitions in Latin America. I would like to welcome to this investment forum. This is very important for Uruguay and constitutes a great honor to be the co-host of this discussion space. The Forum of Investment of Transition, the Energy Transition Investment Forum, is jointly done by IRENA and the government of Uruguay, and in cooperation with OLADI and the Inter-American Bank. We will discuss the framework that might foster the investment, the necessary investment for the sustainable energy transitions as regional and national commitments to increase the emissions measurements to avoid distortions in the market and disincentivize the investment in fossil fuels and tools to mitigate the risks and facilitate the access to financing. I'd like to welcome our panelists, and as I mentioned them, I'll ask them to come to the panel, please. So it's a pleasure for me to welcome and invite to the stage to Mrs. Ministry of Industry and Finance and Industry Mining, Mrs. Elisa Facio from CAF, Jorge Arbacho, Vice President of the Private Sector, from Action Energy, Mr. Miguel Narraz, General Director for South America, from the U.S., to Jose Fernandez, Subsecretary of Economic Growth, Energy and Environment from the Department of State, and from UNDP, Mr. Alfonso Fernandez de Castro, Resident Representative in Uruguay. Likewise, I'm an honor to invite Mr. Gurnos Gunor, Director for Support and the Alliances from IRENA, so you are in good hands.
Thank you very much to moderate this session. I think we have had a very good start this morning for the Latin America Investment Forum. Through this very intensive dialogue among the ministers on broader discussion on energy transition, investments and finance. And we have heard a lot of key issues highlighted by them during the discussions. The minister was there, and she also contributed to the discussions. In fact, the topic of this session is creating enabling conditions conducive to energy transition investments in Latin America. Just to give you a context for that, based on our studies, if we are serious about keeping ourselves on track with the climate commitments, by 2050, $131 trillion of investment will need to go into energy infrastructure, and 80% of it will be for energy transition investments. So we are talking about a huge amount of investments. And these investments, in fact, we need to act quite quickly. We have really a very tight timeline, and we need to have pace and scale to be able to keep 1.5 degree objective alive. For 2030, we have to triple the renewable energy capacity investments. We have to double energy efficiency efforts. And it comes with investment. For just to annual investment terms, we are talking about 1.3 trillion investments each and every year for renewable energy power capacity expansions. So the challenge is big, but I think the political momentum is there, but also action on the ground is there. And that's why I think we have a very good mix of panelists representing a different part of this question. And they will be providing different perspectives from the government point of view, from private sector industry point of view, from bankers' point of view, as well as development partners' point of view, and on several different dimensions of energy investments and how to create right enabling conditions to be able to accelerate energy transition investments. So with this, I would like to start our panel discussion. And first, let me turn to Minister Facio. In the morning, I think we have very good discussion and a lot of feedback from the ministers. Some of the key aspects of the discussion, there was a clear challenge of transmission. No transition without transmission. I think that was also clearly spelled out by one of the ministers. There was how to create right policy instruments. There was a mention of green bonds, mention of guarantee mechanisms, PPAs, how to design right PPAs, how to adjust PPAs to be more accommodative for intermittent capacity. But you also mentioned about e-mobility and how the challenges are, how the transformation is difficult and taking time, and it is not a quick process. So if you can just tell us more about the government's perspective, how you're taking action, how you're taking this discussion forward to create right investment conditions, not only for the power sector, but as you rightly said, for e-mobility, for decarbonizing industrial processes, heating, cooling sectors, etc.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. In Uruguay, we have been through the first energy transition. We started at the end of the 90s by deregulating energy creation. We had a monopolic company for electricity, and in that moment we passed an act where we allowed private companies to create energy, and from that act we had the possibility of having private generators generating energy. And then we had the PPAs, and that worked very well for a lot of years, and it's still working. Now we are in the second energy transition. So now we need to remove the dependence on fossil fuels. And our greatest talent today is to try to take both domestic and industrial transport to electric energy or to renewable energy. And I say this because that's our focus today, and we are not achieving that in a simple way, because although there are lots of incentives from the government, because there are tax benefits for the companies that decide to buy these kind of vehicles, these vehicles are still very expensive, and entrepreneurs find it very difficult, and it happens at the domestic level. I might be 6 years to have the payoff an electric vehicle, and this is not justified. And we are not as aware from the climate point of view to say, well, this makes sense, and it's not. There are no funds enough, so as to say, well, if I buy an electric vehicle, I will have a benefit, or other possibilities that I might not have with fossil fuel vehicles. And that for us is a challenge. Now with the bus fleet, together with the CAF, with the program in motion, we have the expectation of making progress in the issue of fleets, but it's always very difficult. I've said this because within infrastructure investment, we see this as controlled. We have an electric company that has the monopoly of distribution, so there's no transition without transmission. And we've handled this with IDB loans, and that's clearer for people because it's easier for the people to invest in infrastructure than to invest in smaller things. So those are our concerns today.
Thank you very much, Minister. Let me turn to Undersecretary Fernandez with the same question. From your point of view, where do you see the key action that needs to take place in terms of creating right frameworks? Obviously, taking into consideration different endowments of the countries in Latin America, different pace of transformation taking place, and where do you see the innovative policies and measures that can be taken by the countries based on the experience you had in the US?
Gracias. Voy a contestar en español si me...
Thank you very much. I'll answer in Spanish, if you allow me. So first, we need to acknowledge that what has been done in Latin America has put us in a very favorable situation. In my experience, the programs the minister has just described and what we've seen in Chile with green hydrogen and others. So there are programs that are in progress and set Latin America in a very favorable setting. In the US, we've faced the challenge by trying to create incentives. We could have penalized fossil fuels, but we decided that we were going to incentivize the market to use it favorable. And for many years, our government was accused of talking but not doing anything. But 1 year ago, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which devotes the highest amount to technology since in the history of the US, $369 million to incentivize technology. And in the field of mobility, electric mobility, this speaks, and the ministry was speaking about how expensive these cars are. So this act offers a benefit to the electric vehicles manufactured in the US and with minerals from countries with which we had free trade agreements up to $7,500. So the people that buy this kind of car has this deduction in their bill, and this is to incentivize the market. And what has happened? This $369 million were thought for 10 years, but during the first year of this act, we've used almost $337 million. And as we see it, this has created investment, which is already announced in the US, of $137,000 million. So for each dollar that has been spent, we've received 4 of investment. And this is a way of incentivizing the market. And we hope that in 10 years, we will have $1.7 trillion in investments. So we are incentivizing the market so that the market does things instead of penalizing the market for doing wrong things.
Undersecretary, let me turn to Jorge. Let me ask you, how do you see the picture in Latin America in overall? I think you have, as CAF, you have been involved in many countries, but how do you see the overall situation in terms of creating right frameworks for investment? Obviously, there is a lot of conversation about the reforming the climate finance, especially making it more aligned for global South. And within that picture also, I mean, where do you see the key ways of supporting countries in creating right frameworks?
Bueno, antes que nada, muchas gracias por...
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us in this panel. When it comes to funding, of course, this is very important, but there is something that is even more important, and it has to do with the favorable context for investments. Therefore, we need to analyze some areas, some items that I think that are worth mentioning. The first one, before going there, allow me to say that out of the new projects for renewable energy that we are seeing nowadays that are being launched, 85% are concentrated in a few countries, developed countries, 85%. So we also need to take into account an important factor that has to do that many times in our discussions we take into consideration non-developed countries as a part of a unique group, when in fact there are several classifications according to different features. Uruguay is now going through the second stage in this energy transition, whereas other countries are in the process of educating or preparing themselves for the first one. So funding is completely different. The capacities acquired are completely different. Therefore, of course, this is necessary. And before answering your question, I think that the most important thing has to do with the vision from the government, from the parliament, regarding what are we looking for with a broader policy for sustainability, a comprehensive policy. This is key. Something that is very important for developing countries, including Latin America, is for this project to be anchored in fundamentals or principles that are different from the ones that are applied to the United States or other countries. We don't have plans for IRE. So what do we need to do? We need to find solutions that are anchored with competitiveness, that have to do with sustainability. And this includes the resistance for engineering, like in the case of Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, and Chile, but also the existence of critical minerals that are part of this agenda, the existence and the availability of a lot of water that is fundamental for this agenda, the availability of biodiversity that is critical for these, even for the carbon market, forests. So we're talking about an agenda that is much broader, and it requires a more strategic view. So how can we convert this view, this agenda, into something that can be a kickoff for the transition, a productive transition for the region, but that in turn can be translated to the benefit of global decarbonization. So beyond this, how can we convert this agenda into a just and great transition? Not only because through this you can also create employment for developing countries, but also because you can produce green manufacturing and you can reduce the tight market term. Therefore, you can reduce the opposition that we see in many developed countries that are against the agenda for green policies.
Fundamental. Outro ponto fundamental.
Another fundamental topic has to do with the cost of capital. IRENA published a very important report. Everything is very clearly stated there. Another topic there has to do with the technologies like green hydrogen. It is necessary to have a portion of the equity because we're talking about new technologies that are not tested. International trade, this is another leg to be considered. We have to pay much more attention in the relation between decarbonization at an international level and trade, because trade can actually reduce the cost of decarbonization. But for doing so, we need to reduce the blockade that exists today. So this is why the agenda should be an ally in decarbonizing. Another issue that is very important for me has to be with how much support we can receive from the bank. So the creation of funds for funding the development of projects and reduce the dependency on budgets, public budgets, and also to reduce the dependency on the developing banks like CAF. This is fundamental. And this can also be done even with funds to develop projects to make sure that they start to be in operation. Our role is also fundamental when we talk about risk. There are different tools that we're mentioning, like guarantees and other instruments like bonds. Our role, the development bank, is this: to create the conditions so the sector, the private sector, can come into play, to reduce the risk perception. And finally, I think that something that is also very important has to do with coordination. Of course, this is obvious or may sound obvious, but this is not obvious. It is an important factor to take into consideration within federal governments, but also within the different tiers in the government, national, subnational governments as well, and also agencies. Having said that, where are we standing? CAF. This is also valid for other banks. The idea is to create the conditions with whatever we have right now, even though it's not much. A colleague from the IDB said that our contribution for the funding agenda for energy generation gets reduced to 3% in Latin America, 3% only. So if we are so short in money, there's no other view. We need to mobilize resources and risking. And that's where we are right now at CAF. And we are finally defining an agenda that is called power shoring. And it has nothing to do with offshoring, it's power shoring. And it has to do with the idea of how we can convert the green energy available, that it's already there, like in the case of Uruguay, like in that it is completely turned off in our balance sheets, how to make this a tool for those industrial plants that need to decarbonize themselves, to back up not only their clients but themselves. So decarbonization also goes through by Latin America as a solution, but it has to take into account all these factors. This should be part of the agenda.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Because you'll be leaving, just a follow-up question, because you mentioned about the importance of obviously lowering the cost of capital and through action on the enabling frameworks, on reducing the risks associated with projects. But also there's, at the end of the day, there's so much public funding available. And I think the responsibility is to how to use it in a wise way and where needed. Obviously, catalyzing private sector is one of the ways of doing it. I think there was a lot of discussion on transmission, and still in many countries, transmission is done by public. Of course, there are good examples. I think Brazil mentioned in the morning that through transmission auctions, how they are incentivizing private sector coming in. Obviously, innovation, R&D on new emerging technologies. I mean, that's also looking for funding from public sources, coming from governments and multilaterals. But also, we are talking about energy transition. It is a just and fair energy transition, and there is a cost of it, cost of transformation. So, where do we need to focus more? From your point of view, how do you, those scarce resources of public funding should go prioritize?
Bueno, la verdad es que yo creo que esto...
Thank you. I think that this answer really depends on the country conditions. It is difficult to compare Uruguay to Paraguay or to other countries in the region that are at an earlier stage. I am a firm believer in the power of cooperation, even international one. So there is no solution for a global agenda, a collective agenda, where you're just looking at the local interests. As a result, for a region that has fiscal difficulties, that has human resources difficulties, that has investments difficulties with high cost, the only answer is cooperation at all levels, either with CAF as an agency or IRENA or with the IEA. We need to create a broad and holistic view. So I think this is key. This is the core thing, the innovation of technology. Two of the most important elements to solve this decarbonization agenda is this international trade, that we're not even there. And secondly, technologies and innovation and new ideas, that many things are going to be the light very shortly. In the meantime, developing countries who are the ones that are going to suffer the most with this warming process, they need to have access, they need to have resources to adapt to these changes. So we have to see case by case what to do. And decarbonization agendas must take into account also the economic development agendas. So yes, it is a funding and a private agenda, but it is also a development agenda. And finally, this agenda that is different from the rest combines three things without trade-off. We have on our table a high return agenda for companies come in with good projects. The potential is huge, even for power shoring and other paths. This agenda also protects the social agenda, and this also promotes decarbonization. So these three aspects are very important. Even the first one, that is very clear in our microeconomic agenda, are on the table. So what do we need to do? We need to develop a framework to make this visible, to make sure that this agenda makes progress, benefiting the green and the social and agendas, and also benefiting the private investors. Maybe we see a new agenda being created because it is currently being developed. So if possible, we need to combine these three axes, these three topics, with a from the standpoint of a win-win situation for all stakeholders. without losing the vision that this is done as a kickoff, and it has to be really anchored in the foundation of the incentives. We have the conditions to do so.
I would also like to announce that at some point I'm going to collect some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please gear up. After the first round, we will have a couple of questions perhaps. Okay, Miguel. From private sector point of view, what are you looking for to invest? What are the key elements of feeling confident in a market to invest at scale?
Bueno, nosotros como sector.
Well, as the private sector, what we expect in the countries where we invest is to have stability, political stability, economic stability, legal stability, which is very important, with social insurance, safety. So this is what we look for at the first instance. And this is one of the issues that is most difficult to find, as in Chile they were saying, to find a leveled field, because the field now is very unleveled and some referees are not very neutral, and this is giving rise to very serious issues, because we are working with regulations, laws, and systems that were designed 40 or 50 years ago, as the minister was saying, in monopolic conditions or oligopolic conditions, and for technologies that were hydrothermal in big plants. And the model that we need now, as we all see and accepted, is a very different model. It's a model where we have hundreds of parties with technologies that have variable production, with lots of demand control, generation, where we'll have batteries at all the levels, at the vehicle levels, which, because nowadays these vehicles can work as energy centrals. They can buy and sell energy, and we need a balance there. So we need to have a leveled field. And in the US, in fact, the IRA and others, not tax-based institutions have worked very well. But in other countries, it's not as easy to implement those mechanisms. And as with the words of the Secretary of the UN, we've already opened the doors to hell, and we have to close them. And I do believe that we need to rate the carbon, and that those who are contaminating have to pay. And from there, we can have lots of funds from those who are contributing to develop enormously the climate disasters that are very expensive for all of us, and someone has to pay for that. So we need to rate carbon, and that would be a way of leveling the field. So besides changing legislation because it's obsolete everywhere, also in Europe. In Europe, 2 weeks ago, they agreed a new model to set prices in order to give guarantees to renewable investments. But I firmly believe that above all, we should focus, especially in these countries, in those activities that are contaminating and contributing to destroying our planet. We have to close the doors of the hell.
Alfonso, do we have how can we create a level playing field and avoid market distortions, and so that renewables can compete in equal terms with other technologies, and we can deploy more renewables at scale? What are your observations on that?
Bueno, creo que
Well, I think that, as it has been said, we need to close the doors of hell. So, on the one hand, we need to make sure that the carbon pays the impact it is having. And there's another data which is not minor, which is the subsidies they are receiving. There are studies, and probably figures might vary, but in 2022 there was an estimation that around $7 trillion dollars went to subsidies for carbon. So we have a financial gap, and so we are financing energies that are taking us to that engine that is feeding and is taking us to go to crash into a wall. In this case, from the UNDP, what we are putting at the service of the countries and the partners is we have our institutional capacities. So at the central and regional level, and at the level of the countries, to work with what was said. So going from the macro to the most micro issues. So from the countries, and working in a concerted way with other countries and with national determined contributions, with a view of sustainable development, which should be integral. And we can work, and we work in the construction of indicators and plans we put at your disposal together with other parties, capacity and technical assistance, tools, just to set an example regarding what was already mentioned, the issue of de-risking renewable energies initiatives. The UNDP, together with other actors, has a platform where with a systemic and sustained way, and this systemic and sustained has appeared everywhere. And there you see how you can see a de-risking from the policy point of view, from the financial point of view, what kind of incentives can be done, and with a medium and long-term view. So I think that's a fundamental element. And based on that, to have a clear view, and then to sector ideas. So this calls for coherence, and then walk the talk. So to walk on this commitment that has been made. So to mention some programs in where we are working, and always with partners, so as UNDP and with the GAE Adaptation Plan, World Climate Fund, and many other partners which are in this panel and also in this discussion which takes place during this week. Well, to look for these catalytic funds. For example, in Ecuador, we've been working on low emission mobility with different approaches, approach on regulation, the approach on the total cost of ownership, and how these flows can align in energies that perhaps today is more expensive, but when you see all the life, the product life, for example, of these vehicles, there's a point where I'm getting financial benefits, and this is very much related to behavioral change, which is an issue we can't forget, because those behavioral changes should be incorporated in our programs and projects, besides all the elements, financial elements and institutional elements. So there are lots of elements, but we need to have we have to be in the same line as the UN, and together with the other parties, to see what the view of the country is, to see what the view of the region, and from this view to be in line, so there's a coherence in the actions where we contribute.
Thank you very much, Alfonso. We have finalized the first round of interventions by our panelists, and at this point I would like to turn to the audience. If you have any questions, a couple of questions I can take at this point. And we have microphones in the first couple of rows, and also a mobile microphone, I hope. If there are any questions, of course. If not, okay, let me continue then. Let me turn to... You have to leave. Yes.
Yeah, I have to go to the airport right now.
No problem.
I'm
No problem.
deeply sorry for that. So thank you very much.
Thanks for doing. All right. Let me turn to Minister Facio again. In fact, a similar question that I asked to Jorge about the public financing and the policies around it. If you can just tell us about what the government of Uruguay is doing in that space, and what kind of policies you have developed for wise using of public funds for investments or otherwise.
Well, in Uruguay, as I was telling you, for the first energy transition, we used private investment through PPAs. Now, for the second transition, well, I want to say something about this. In that moment, we received a very big investment from the government because we signed contracts for 30 years and they are still in force. So we are still paying that bill, the bill of that investment. So we invested money on that, so that today we have the matrix, the electric matrix we have today. But it has been something expensive. We are very happy because first things first. And which are first things? Well, first is infrastructure from my point of view. Then we can think about other things such as electric mobility and others. So regarding which are the policies that we are now working on, is during this year we launched a modification in the electrical market that existed since 2002 to acknowledge the firm power of renewable energies. And now the private sector can sell energy to other privates, and this is incentivizing the investment of private parties in generation. We also have funds which are taken from the road network, urban for buses network. We take part of that, of the money of the fuel they pay for the electric mobility. So we are taking a small percentage of the cost of fossil fuels as a rate to create a fund, and with that we can invest in the changes of the fleet for public transport. And there was something else. We are very much focused in green hydrogen, not because for Uruguay and for the use of Uruguay it will be something useful, but we are thinking in exports, because the fuel that is generated is expensive and it's not for our market, but we are thinking about an opportunity of growing as a country by exporting them. And we are thinking that this should be done through private investments. So what we do from the government is to incentivize those private investments with tax benefits and other regulatory benefits. And this is our investment plan, so the promotion of investments.
Yes, sir. And the Secretary Fernandez, a similar question for you also. You already mentioned about different mechanisms to stimulate private sector investments in energy transition space. But can you also give us a bit a few more concrete examples, for instance, on public financing schemes to incentivize, to attract private sector into energy transition specifically, if you have?
Nos perdimos el micrófono, así que vamos a ver. Nosotros lo que hemos visto en Estados Unidos, primero, muchas de las cosas que dijo la ministra también ocurren allá a nivel estatal. En Estados Unidos como un...
According to what we have seen in Brazil, for example, different states have different taxes. But it is also important to mention that renewable energies have turned into a business that many times does not require any kind of subsidies. Nowadays, in the call for bids at a state level, we see that they are proposing offers with wind and solar energies, hydroelectric. So we have reached a momentum in which this is competitive. I mean, renewable energies. So this poses a challenge for the states to ensure whether you're not giving too much, but you are incentivizing development of these technologies. So it is difficult, yes, but it is something important. And this is something that one thing is to talk about sovereign warranties, and a different thing is to avoid privatizing losses. And this is something that we need to take into account from a regulatory body standpoint.
Undersecretary Fernandez mentioned about the sovereign guarantees. Obviously, there is less and less appetite to provide sovereign guarantees by governments. So, where do you see, what kind of other options, viable options you see in terms of public support for private investments?
Well, bueno, voy a contestar en castellano, perdón. Yo creo que...
I'm going to answer in Spanish. I understand that governments are reluctant to offer sovereign warranties. What we need to structure investments, as I said before, is to have a stable system. We need infrastructure, either from the government or elsewhere. Chile has a salvage problem because of the lack of structure they promised to have, which nowadays makes for investing entities to lose money due to the lack of infrastructure, because they have been very successful in installing renewable plants, but the state has not met what they promised. They didn't comply. So therefore, what we need is for governments to guarantee that the conditions are fair, that are honest and equal. And something that also happens to almost every country in the world is that the mechanisms to guarantee the price stability are obsolete, because they were designed for a completely different world. So we need to have a radical change when it comes to investment. Renewable energies in general, they don't need subsidies, they need aid. So the public money has to go to other places, not to investment in wind farms, because we are much more competitive even more competitive than fossil fuel systems. So in general, they are paid the price that they need. So they're profitable. There's no need to lower the price. So this incentive must go to the creation of infrastructure. If there is a need for subsidy, then they should go to maybe hiring the skilled personnel. So these incentives should be done through programs for smaller installations for total supply of water and energy, in order to provide access to many isolated places.
Hoy deben ir enfocadas básicamente a tres.
So this covers three aspects: how to generate the warranties needed in order to guarantee the penetration of renewables, which are not yet, we're having some issues with the mic. So these activities are being paid according to the price and the cost of its production, as we all know. So we have to work with e-mobility. E-cars are no more expensive. They are not expensive, they are cheaper. We usually have a car that would last for 8 or 10 years. So it is actually cheaper to have a thermal car than a car that is electric. So we need to change that.
El hidrógeno. Yo discrepo un poquito. Uruguay necesita hidrógeno verde. Todos los países tenemos que descarbonizar.
So all countries need to decarbonize using thermal resources. So we're thinking about big projects to sell and export to Europe and Japan, but you need to start by creating the structure. Thermal options, which have not been yet fully identified, are also another tool with a lot of potential. So we need to dedicate time to these assessments. And we also need to change the way in which we, governments, companies understand this. Would you mind asking the speaker to remove the mic a little bit away from its mouth?
Y esto es una trampa, otra más. El año
Can you please ask the speaker to put the mic a little bit further away from him, because we're having some audio issues at the booth. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. So back in 2022, we were able to invest and generate 68 million megawatts with renewable cost of 68. However, the survey is being posed to the population still has the message of this energy is being expensive because e-cars are still expensive. So we really need to change the way in which we approach the citizenship with the messages that we portray.
Alfonso, where should public money go? A lot of emphasis on infrastructure. We have been hearing from various panelists earlier in the discussions also. Although bringing private sector into so-called natural monopolies like transmission, grid infrastructure, is a quite well-established practice in certain parts of the world, US, many countries in the EU, and now Brazil organizing transmission auctions. I mean, is it something that public sector should give way to private sector, or any other ways of wisely spending public funds?
Gracias.
Thank you. Funding has to go wherever is necessary. Where do we need it the most? It is needed in many, many different places. I'm going to focus on two. One has to do with catalytic projects that have a long-term vision. We are talking about e-mobility. and the need to generate and address different topics at the same time. Regulation to strengthen it, topics that have to do with incentives for fossil energies, but this is not given to electromobility, at least working the same way. Topics that we were saying before about behavior. So we're talking about 15 million dollars, and this has to do with the learning curve, with the execution, the design, and the monitoring process. So we can have a retrofit process to generate public policies. So being more strategic in the kind of strategies and the kind of investment that is going to feed in turn new policies, new public policies. Many times we already have the structure, but they are not well disseminated. And another key factor has to do with a condition that is completely necessary. We were talking about this earlier on. Has to do with alliances at two levels. Alliances between different national stakeholders, either local or even international ones, with a very articulated roadmap in order to strengthen the capacities within the countries themselves. So it is fundamental. In countries where we have had successful stories, we see that the institutions have been reinforced. And these things do not happen randomly. Whole of government, it is transmitted and translated in these joint endeavors. So we need to take a look at this, whether we're talking about the first or the second transition. And we were able to be actors in the first place on how to turn these institutions to be strong enough to have things happening. So we of course need to invest in technology, but we usually tend to forget the need of having strong institutions, not bureaucratic ones, but strong ones, which are going to be capable of generating public policies with different capacities.
Thank you very much. Let me turn one more time to our audience. Any contributions you may want to make. We have one question up there, if we can get a microphone there. And another, do we have a microphone? You can take my microphone.
It's free.
Please introduce yourself and to whom you're asking questions.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Frank Wang, and I'm from GEDCO, the Global Energy Interconnection Development and Cooperation Organization. It's an international organization dedicated to promoting sustainable energy infrastructure, grid connectivity to increase the share of renewable energy in the energy system. So I have a question for, I don't know to whom my question should go, but my question is actually about the role of transmission in the energy transition. I think the expression of no energy transition without transmission is a very useful and a very good expression of the role of transmission in the energy transition. We know the investment in grid infrastructure is of great importance to the overall energy transition, but we all know that it's very difficult to make investment happen in this area because it's very hard for investors to recover their cost in a very rational period of time. I think one of the questions is that there is kind of hidden value in energy in transmission lines. For example, we have transmission lines which can connect generation with consumption, but this transmission line can also enhance the overall security of the system. But this part of value is not reflected in the overall trade-off of energy infrastructure. So my question is how we can incorporate hidden value in the overall calculation of transmission projects so that we can have more incentive to make transmission happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's have the other question also. As briefly as possible, please.
Gracias. Me llamo Jorge Ayala, represento a...
My name is Jorge Ayala. I represent two small associations from Nicaragua, from the Mount of Nicaragua. We are project developers. We have a proposal which is very small compared with everything that is said here, but let's say that we've been working for 30 years, working on energy transition, keeping forests and developing utilities, social interest projects, rural electrification, drinkable water, and I'm explaining all these because I don't know where the participation of people, because we have the right of participating in community projects. So yesterday we had a training session with Irina, and I had to speak about this, about the difficulties we face, about the hostilities we face, and difficulties, additional difficulties that we face. So one of the things that surprised me when I heard you is that you said that you don't want that the state participates in the renewable energy projects, but you were saying that Chile failed because the field was not prepared by the infrastructures. So first, I think it's a contradiction, but I wanted to make a point in another thing. I want to make a point from the being small. So I'm speaking about a 1 megawatt project. We need 3.5 million. We can't pay more than 3%, and we have already our equity, so we have 1 million and something saved, but no one funds us. So the issue is, this morning, many representatives of several countries spoke about the necessary transition, which has to be fair and just and open for everyone. So how can we do it so that the people organizes, because the people wants to participate. The people in general, lots of people, perhaps not a lot of people, but we don't want to repeat the fossil fuels model. So how can we set apart a little piece of the pie of positive discrimination, like what is being done in some countries to fight against sexism, proposing other models based on small distributed generation does not need an enormous infrastructure change, but that will probably be more human resources respectable. So I would like to know how we can participate and how we can include this awareness in all the analyses that are done, especially in the financial ones, because we can do what the bank demands, and we can submit a hydrology as all, and with better technical data than other private company. But we are private small entities. So this is a very broad reflection, but it's also a question for the representative of the UNDP, so that our projects, community projects, how can we be heard at least, and how can we participate even with a very small part so to see that our model works. Thank you very much.
Two questions. One is transmission. I think we, to a certain extent, we touched upon transmission at different parts of our conversation. But if you would like to focus a bit more on that.
Hola. Bueno,
Well, if we say transition is not possible without transmission, and I told you what our experience in Uruguay. So we demonopolized generation. The public electricity company had contracts with the companies that created the generations to buy biofuels, but the distribution, the transmission has always been made by the public company. And this is as roads. In Uruguay, we have this model. So the public company has the transmission and distribution, and this, so it also generates, but it's not monopolic in the generation. With roads, and it's alike. So national roads in general are built by the Ministry of Works and Public Works, but in certain circumstances we've had experiences of certain roads or that were built by private sectors. So they can, for a certain limit of years, they can charge for a toll in those roads or routes. So tolls are paid. So our experience is not that, because the distribution is monopolic in Uruguay, so we don't charge for tolls, but it's a model that can use. In this case, but in Uruguay, we use a different model for roads. I hope I replied to your question.
On transmission or broadly grid infrastructure point? Yeah, please.
Yeah, let me just answer. See, I sense a common answer to both questions, if I understood them correctly, and that's tariffs. The tariffing regime in any system is fundamental. One of the reasons why you have problems with transmission is that there's not enough incentives in the tariffing system for them to be built. And actually in Chile you have a problem right now with, there's plenty of generation, but it's not enough transmission. On Nicaragua, I mean, this is a problem that you face in terms of how do you deal with rural communities that cannot afford the cost. You see it in, not only in electricity, but you see it in telephony, in telecoms. You have to have the kinds of tariffing that includes subsidies for those who need it. And I think in both cases, we cannot avoid the issue of tariffs, and that goes also to the issue of business climate and uncertainty. Companies need to believe that tariffs will go up when needed, despite the fact that oftentimes you will have public pressure to not raise them. So at some point we should talk about the effects of tariffing regimes in both cases.
Bueno, hablando de la transmisión, yo creo que
Speaking about transmission, I think that in general, what we still lack is that public companies define what transmission they need, because in the end, transmission has to be paid by the client. All the costs are finally borne by the client. So it's not an issue on how it is paid, but you have to plan it correctly. You have to plan it with time, ahead of time, and you have to think that the current needs will be different in the future. So it's important that they are planned. All system plans are finally paid by clients, either public or private, big or small, but this is so. And I would like perhaps I did not explain myself correctly, but I was speaking about big plants, these utility scales that do not need support, but so I did say that we need two kinds of aids for vulnerable consumers and aids for other installations that generate energy, or microgrids, which need, and besides they are less expensive because normally they need some help, and high consumption, which is a hybrid between energy saving, efficiency. So it's important that we reduce the energy consumption, the energy use, and those installations that you mentioned, small installations, distributed, that save distribution, that save leaks, they are very important, and they are being made in massive quantities. Perhaps in Nicaragua there's an issue, and perhaps others partners have said that this is not for everyone, because each country has their own characteristics. In Europe, those kind of installations are spreading everywhere because they are great. So what I meant is that big plants do not need this aid, so aid should be directed to other kinds of activities.
Gracias. Bueno.
Well, as the rest of the panelists have said, and as the man in the audience, well, there's no small intervention. So when there's a need of people to access to electricity, which is a basic supply, well, we need to look for the solutions. As mentioned, there are different approaches. So we need an understanding of the problem and which the solutions are. And in many countries, I know that in many cases, although the level of access to energy is high, perhaps 96, 97%, these 3% of people that do not have electricity, those are 100%. So they need efficient and concrete solutions and viable solutions. So two more thoughts. One is, even in the big projects, as there is a system for environmental and social safeguards. We have to continue strengthening it, and we have to make sure that in those communities where there are big installations, and we were talking about the regional team about something which is being done in Colombia. Well, how is this affecting their lives? And we need to have a balance. And finally, I want to say that yes, finally there is a cost. We have to look for the technologies, and there have to be banking projects. So in some countries where we are working already, but when we are trying to identify the last mile. How many people are we talking about? Let's align solutions, innovation, funding, and institutional capacity. And there we have to be, all of us have to be there. And communities and people working with communities are fundamental actors.
Being flagged that we are running out of time. But before we close, just 1 minute, as we are approaching COP28 in Dubai. And I would just like to hear from you your expectations from COP28. As you know, this global stocktake outcomes will come out, which will say that we are out of track for climate objectives, and there needs to be even corrective action to stay on track for 1.5-degree objectives, and to move forward to fast-track energy transition. So, I want to hear from you your perspective, from your expectations from COP28, and what would make you happy if that happens.
Bueno, la verdad que yo no voy a ir, no voy a ir a la COP, va a ir el...
I won't be attending COP28, to be honest with you. The Vice Ministry will attend it on our behalf, so I'm not really aware of all topics, so I won't be able to answer this question. Thank you. What's clear to us is that if we are to continue as we are, we will find a no-return point. So we need to accelerate transition, definitely. There are ways to do that. What industries are doing right now, the way that they are able to be compliant with these objectives, acquiring new technologies that we still need to continue developing, we simply need to basically dedicate more funds to this, either for infrastructure, as we were mentioning before, either by subsidies, but we need to definitely accelerate this process. Otherwise, if we continue at this pace, we won't meet the goal. And we are worried about this. This is a common concern because this is something that we owe to our children and grandchildren. On the one hand, increase the level of ambitions, make sure that we concrete this increase in funding. The commitment for funding at a global level is not being met. If we were to put the money on the table as we promised to do, we would be in better conditions. So we must comply, we must meet our promise. And another necessary element that could be transformational to show such commitment from all the stakeholders has to do with the last COP, where the loss and damages mechanism was approved, and we need to make this feasible, either as an operation or by funding it. That would be a quantitative leap, but this is yet to be defined. Thank you so much. I work at a company, at a Spanish multinational company with 50,000 workers worldwide. We work with construction sector, with water management, renewable energies, very sectors. And we are neutral in carbon over 6 years. So the neutral carbon, it is something achievable right now. You just want to achieve it. This is why I'm such an optimistic person in this sense. We have done it already. But when I look at what's going on in the rest of the world, when I hear that we need to triple to 2030 the renewable energy installations, we just have 7 years, guys. And to develop a renewable energy project doesn't take less than 6 or 7 or even 8 years. So that would be impossible. Tripling the installed capacity, it can be done in the world. Of course, forecasting, this is a common issue we always have. Forecasting sometimes is not that nice, but the reduction of emissions is key. And I am becoming more pessimist regarding this because we are really acting very actively to meet this 1.5 degree, to be carbon positive. There are some organizations that are doing this and some other organizations as well, but not even the citizens themselves are taking measures. We continue to behave in the same way that we have been behaving over the last 10 years. But we want everything to be done by companies, governments. That's not the way. Or by the Americans or the Chinese. But I see that even at a personal level, all decisions that we make, at the end of the day, are not reducing our carbon footprint. So I think we won't be meeting the goal. And I follow Gutierrez a lot. And if you follow his declarations, you see how he becomes more desperate. Truly. Because every time he has to listen to the experts, well, more doubts are posed. We participate, of course, in the COP, but I don't see how we are going to change. To start with, at a personal level, we're not changing our behavior. Hello, I just regret my answer. I just wanted to add something. Something that Jorge was mentioning before is that we're not in the same stage. So when you say triple, okay, we are already talking about 98% of the renewable energy. Why should we triple this? So we really need to take the measures regarding what we are doing, because if you say double, okay, if I am very low, I won't be able to double. So this is not something that is fair. So when we talk about measurement, we need to take this into account. We need to take into account what are the base foundation, the baselines. I am optimistic, by the way. And I think that what we are doing right now, talking about these issues, all the people being gathered, all the people attending, this also creates awareness. And for us as experts, we need to continue to have these positive exchanges. So I am positive.
Brings us to the end of our panel discussion. And many thanks to all our panelists for the great discussion. And let's give them a big applause, please.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Con esto damos cierre al panel. Le agradecemos a los panelistas, al moderador, a todos ustedes y les pedimos que tomemos una breve pausa. En 15 minutos comenzamos con la siguiente sesión. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Un gusto. ¿Cómo estás? Bien.
No,